The Synchromystic presents Synchromystique. Bertrand Russell and Neoplatonism. Recently, a viewer, to Miss Valkyrie 529, wrote, "I'd love to hear your views on Russell's critique of Neoplatonism. As I recall, it seemed fairly dismissive. Tackling Russell head-on is a pretty formidable challenge. His history of philosophy is a monumental achievement." To the last sentences, it is, and it is. I'm not going to pretend to give an answer in the sense of saying anything authoritative or definitive. What I'll do instead is simply gesture toward trajectories for study. For those who haven't watched the fuller treatment of Neoplatonism that gave rise to this question, I'll do a quick review. However, if I may say so, I do hope that interested viewers will take a look at the longer presentation anyway, whether for the first time or as a refresher. I'll also say a few words about Bertrand Russell, who I think I mentioned but did not really figure into that video. But first, we might translate the question into the form of a rough argument, or at least we could adapt the question into a sort of argument. So at a superficial level, you might think something like this. Premise 1, Neoplatonism is a religious version of Platonism. Premise 2, Bertrand Russell was or seemed to be anti-religious. Therefore, 3, Russell was against Neoplatonism, QED. Of course, my phraseology here is more than a little tongue-in-cheek. Additionally, the second premise is framed in terms of speculations about Russell's psychology. That said, notice that if you take a different posture toward religion than Russell took, then you might feel quite differently than Russell did about Neoplatonism. And that's assuming, by the way, the truth of premise 1. I won't try to defend premise 1 here, but for a bit of a defense of it, see the past video. Finally, although it may go without saying, even if you don't share Russell's aversion to religion and you accept premise 1, you could object to Neoplatonism on other grounds. So much for that as a short introduction. There are a few complications that I think are worth exploring at greater length. So let's run through some of the history and then get to a few of those complications now. And by the way, I usually try to make the slideshow somewhat visually involved, but I have not done that here for reasons of time. First, it's worth saying something about Bertrand Russell. Russell was born into a British aristocratic family in 1872, and he lived to the age of 97, dying in 1970. In his early years, he studied both logic and mathematics at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. Indeed, Russell made major contributions to both fields, math and logic. For example, in the 1910s, and with Alfred North Whitehead, Russell wrote the monumental three-part Principia Mathematica. The two men, Russell and Whitehead, advanced the view that logic is the foundation of mathematics. The collaboration with Whitehead enabled Russell to modify theses he first advanced in a book titled The Principles of Mathematics, published in 1903. In that earlier work, Russell advanced a strong form of logicism, or the view that logic and mathematics are, any appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, the same disciplines. In 1911, the Austrian-born polymath Ludwig Wittgenstein came to Cambridge expressly to study under Russell. To make a long story very short, Russell and the early Wittgenstein espoused views which were eventually taken up by and associated with a group called the Vienna Circle. A number of views are relevant here, such as logical atomism, logical empiricism, and logical positivism, and these are usually distinguished. But for our purposes, we'll simply skate across the surface of things and say something briefly about the important verificationist principle. According to this principle, the only statements that are meaningful are those that are either logical truths, such as A equals A, or all bachelors are unmarried, or else the statements are quote-unquote empirically verifiable. Now, this meant that if you're not dealing with a tautology, then you have to have some way to confirm what is being asserted. And here, confirm means via sense experience, observation, etc. This could be actual experience, or in some more sophisticated versions of verificationism, it could be possible experience as well. Wittgenstein later abandoned this view. Wittgenstein eventually developed the idea that meaning was bound up with what he called language games. And for him, philosophy became a form of language therapy, whereby the task of the philosopher was to try to solve problems by showing that they arose when language from one game was mistakenly applied to another game. For his part, Russell seems to have remained firm in his belief in the earlier view. In other words, for Russell, the world of experience, sense data, is the only world we have. And since science in its various branches specializes in careful investigation of this experience, when we talk about our best theories about the world, we're just talking about our best scientific theories, or else we're talking nonsense. Now, in this picture, supernatural entities, or any sort of supersensible world, was, to borrow a Britishism, simply rubbish. In this, Russell stood in a tradition known as British Empiricism, beginning with people like the 17th century English philosopher and political theorist John Locke and the 18th century Scottish historian and skeptic David Hume. You can draw a line of more or less consistent commitments to Russell and the logical positivists. Okay. Let's switch gears. I started the Neoplatonism video with a quotation from Russell's Principia Mathematica co-author. A.N. Whitehead once wrote, quote, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Platonism, in one of its many Neoplatonic incarnations, was much more evident in the other great Western tradition that is usually juxtaposed with British empiricism. I'm talking, of course, about Continental Rationalism. Continental Rationalism stemmed from the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, who, similarly to Plato, held that knowledge was grounded in unchanging ideas accessible via reason. Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, seems to go back to St. Augustine's si falor sum, even if I am mistaken, I exist. And then there's Dutch Jewish thinker Baruch Spinoza, whose system, often described as a form of pantheism, the idea that God is identical with the universe, sounds numerous Neoplatonic notes. And we shouldn't neglect 17th to 18th century German polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, whose complicated metaphysical concept that there is a plurality of what he called monads, harmoniously existing in the best of all possible worlds. This is reminiscent of the Neoplatonic chain of being. Plato himself, of course, is the wellspring, arguably, in the West anyway, of thought about an imperceptible world outside of time and space, a world that is more important than the one we see, hear, and touch. Plato and idealism. Much philosophical jargon is tricky. Many words, like realist, have different meanings depending on the branch of philosophy we're thinking about. Neoplatonist is arguably such a word, as I discussed in the previous video. But here I'd like to highlight the word idealist. Plato was an idealist. This is not only because he argued for the real existence of ideas, what are often called the Platonic forms, but also because he thought that the everyday objects of sense perception derived from these perfect, spaceless, timeless, unchanging ideas. So Plato believed in ideal reality, and Plato privileged ideal reality above material reality, and this picture has been attractive to untold numbers of thinkers throughout the ages. For example, it appealed to many early Christians, such as those of the Alexandrian school of theologians, people like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, as well as to St. Augustine. One writer goes so far as to state Neoplatonism was virtually synonymous with philosophy in late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, and it was taken to its apogee by Avicenna. Again, see the longer video for a lot of detail here. However, although Plotinus is frequently credited as the seminal formulator of Neoplatonism, his shadowy teacher, Ammonius Saccas, deserves careful attention. For an introduction to Ammonius, see 10 Mystery Men. But there is some historical intrigue as well. As discussed in our main deep dive video, after Emperor Justinian the Great closed the Athenian Academy, a cadre of scholars resurrected it in the city of Haran in Turkey, near the border with Syria. For some cryptopolitics in the general Turkey-Constantinople area, see 10 Occultist Spies. But meanwhile, in the West, Neoplatonism, combined with angelology, was preserved by Pseudo-Dionysius, whose works were later translated by the Irish-born 9th century philosopher John Scotus Erigena. Also known as John the Scot, he ended up in the Frankish court of Charles the Bald. In other words, it spread all through Europe. Neoplatonism did. After the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, Byzantine Greek Neoplatonism was transplanted to Italy, for example, via Gemistus Plethon, also known as Pletho. Pletho was a passionate pagan Platonist in the manner of Proclus and Iamblichus, and he persuaded Renaissance aristocrat Cosimo de' Medici to sponsor a Platonic academy at Florence. Curiously, de' Medici's academy was directed by the ostensibly Catholic priest and humanist Marsilio Ficino. From this Florentine base, Neoplatonism spread to Rome, for example, through Cardinal Pietro Bembo, and this results in what observers have thought of as an occult infiltration of the Roman Catholic Church, for more on which see Craig Heimbichner, Michael Hoffman, Taylor Marshall, and so on. And somehow or other, Neoplatonism also reached Germany, as is evident in thinkers such as Bishop Nicholas of Cusa and the innovative alchemist Paracelsus. Neoplatonism really got traction in England due to the work of the late 17th century scholars known as the Cambridge Platonists. On the continent, Immanuel Kant's innovative thinking kickstarted a movement called German Idealism, which was advanced by people like G.W.F. Hegel and Friedrich von Schelling, both of whom had Neoplatonic influences. In Hegel's case, this was principally through Proclus, whereas Schelling was more in the mold of Plotinus. For more detail on all this, again, see the full presentation. Christian Wildberg, in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, Neoplatonism, sums up the situation saying that Neoplatonic ideas have continued to influence Western thinkers of the idealist persuasion, such as the Cambridge Platonists, who were really Neoplatonists, Leibniz, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, Bergson, and Pierre Teilhard du Chardin, and so on. As an aside, modernist Catholics like Teilhard have built upon the process view of reality, first articulated by Plotinus, arguably. Translated into contemporary jargon, this has become the evolutionary paradigm. One could argue that most of the worldviews on offer these days are just variants of evolutionism. For example, one writer observed the major difference between Teilhard and the 19th century English biologist Charles Darwin is that the latter, as a rigorous scientist, interpreted evolution in terms of materialism and mechanism, and possibly even atheism, while the Jesuit priest, Teilhard, as a process philosopher, gave a planetary interpretation of evolution in terms of spiritualism, finalism, and a panentheistic God. Similarly, occultist H.P. Blavatsky basically took issue with Darwinism, not because of its evolutionary premises, but because of its naturalistic premises. Blavatsky created a theosophical version of evolution by grafting the tenets of spiritualism and organic science, among other things, to the chassis of Alexandrian Neoplatonism. Okay, but Russell was obviously British. So, let's say something a bit more about Britain specifically. Consider then the British idealists. This would be philosophers like F.H. Bradley, T.H. Green, J.M.E. McTaggart, and A.E. Taylor. Many of these guys espoused absolute idealism, the theory that reality is a single unified consciousness. Now, it turns out that many Brits were suspicious of Hegel, and since British idealism was also sometimes called British Neo-Hegelianism, there was, in some quarters, a strong reaction against Hegel's influence, and that led to a corresponding depreciation of Neoplatonism. Okay, let me summarize. For hundreds of years, Neoplatonism, in its dizzying variety of forms, was a dominant version, not just of Platonism, but via offshoot isms like idealism, of philosophy in general. However, there were plenty of reactions against it. For example, in Britain, enter Bertrand Russell. Besides the aforementioned Whitehead, the young Russell was taught by James Ward. Ward was steeped in and an exponent of British idealism, albeit as merged with something he referred to as metaphysical pluralism. Under the influence of Ward's metaphysical pluralism, but recoiling against idealism, at the turn of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell and his kindred spirit G.E. Moore staged a revolt against idealism. Drawing upon the work of the German logician Gottlob Frege, Moore and Russell founded Analytic Philosophy, a branch of Anglo-American thinking that emphasizes the techniques of logic and linguistics. That is some background. Russell's aversion. The fact that Russell felt compelled to revolt against a form of idealism that had scaled back its influences from Neoplatonism suggests that Russell might have reacted even more strongly against undiluted Neoplatonism. Indeed, there are several places where Russell snipes at Neoplatonism directly, with his characteristic blend of empiricism and droll British humor. For example, in his History of Western Philosophy, Russell describes Plato's Pythagorean cosmological treatise Timaeus as, quote, containing more that is simply silly than is found in Plato's other writings, end quote. To re-emphasize what I stated in the introduction, I'm not pretending to be exhaustive here. Even restricting ourselves to the history of Western philosophy, Russell's full treatment of Neoplatonism runs several hundred pages. But let's add that Russell seems, to some extent, to have thought of Christianity itself as a form, perhaps even the dominant form, of Neoplatonism. In one essay, he says that when the Greek world became converted to Christianity, It combined the new creed with Platonic metaphysics, and so gave birth to theology. Elsewhere, Russell refers to Orthodox Christianity as a modification of Platonism. This is, arguably, underscored in Russell's mind by virtue of the historic influence of the 2nd to 3rd century church figure, Origen. Russell thinks that, like his contemporary Plotinus, Origen was a pupil of Ammonius Saccas, whom, as we have said, many regard as the founder of Neoplatonism. Origen advanced the synthesis of Greek philosophy in Hebrew scriptures that up to that point in time had remained more or less haphazard and fragmentary. Russell hardly thought, however, that Origen was a pillar of Catholic orthodoxy. Russell catalogues what he regarded as Origen's aberrations, both theological and personal, and it's worth registering the point that, as strange as it may sound, it's not certain that Origen and Plotinus were instructed by the same Ammonius. For another mention of this detail, see 10 Mystery Men. A key element, of course, of Russell's critique is his naturalism. Naturalism is the view that there is nothing supernatural. As the late 20th century American astronomer and science popularizer Carl Sagan used to say about the universe, the cosmos is all there is, or was, or ever will be. In another place in History of Philosophy, Russell explains the popularity of Neoplatonism, and later Christianity, by virtue of its being a refuge from fear of death and from the miseries of our terrestrial existence. Now, for all Russell's criticisms of him, Russell seems here to have taken a page out of the playbook of Friedrich Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, Plato falsified reality out of resentment. According to Nietzsche, Plato invented the idea of another world, one that is much more real than the ever-changing, unstable world in which we live. Thus, for Russell, objectionable aspects of Neoplatonism, for example, its role in bolstering belief in extramundane reality, are predictable consequences of his non-theism. By the way, I'll try to remember to post the script where, in the footnotes, I clarify and go into additional detail. Russell claimed he was an agnostic in a philosophical sense, but he also said that if he was speaking to an audience of lay people, non-philosophers, he would say he was an atheist. So here I'm trying to say non-theist in order to be neutral between those two words. Somewhere, although I am too lazy to look it up, I ran across some of Russell's critiques of Nietzsche. He didn't actually, as far as I know, create a book-length critique, and part of the reason for that was because he was very dismissive of Nietzsche in general. Evidently, he said of Nietzsche that Nietzsche is not a philosopher, he's a poet. And then he added, and not a very good poet. For more on Friedrich Nietzsche, you can see 10 Nazi Occultists Part 1. Russell's Affinity. Almost more interesting than his aversions are those aspects of Platonism to which Russell had sympathy. For example, it's worth noting that commentators assert Russell's endorsement of a form of Platonic realism. Historically, this arose with respect to what medieval philosophers called the problem of universals. As touched on in the Deep Dive Into Neoplatonism video, a universal is that which can be predicated of many particular things. One Platonist argument would be something like this: stop signs are red, Honeycrisp apples are red. Therefore, there is something, and you have to say the is with emphasis, there is something that stop signs and Honeycrisps have in common: redness. Or again, you're human and I'm human. Therefore, there is something that you and I have in common, namely humanness, and so on. Classically, Platonists held that these entities, humanness, redness, etc., exist in some Platonic heaven. To the Platonist, these entities are the forms or ideas, both capitalized, spoken of previously. They exist outside of time and space, and they even exist necessarily. Incidentally, however, and speaking loosely, Augustine famously relocated Plato's forms from Platonic heaven into the mind of God. Whether the forms construed this way, usually called divine conceptualism, count as abstract or concrete objects is too difficult a question to broach here. Complicating things even further, the French Oratorian Catholic priest Nicolas Malebranche later developed a similar position to Augustine's, typically glossed as an attempted synthesis of Augustine and Descartes, and some classify this as a theological form of Platonism. The wrinkle here is metaphysical realism's great rival, nominalism, which also happened to be the first rigorously empiricist philosophy in Western history. The upshot is the probable attenuating effect on Malebranche of what Jason Jordan has called Cartesian nominalism. In other words, it might be that Augustine's divine conceptualism held that the forms were bona fide abstract objects, whereas Malebranche altered this picture by making them concrete mental particulars. And when many philosophers today describe divine conceptualism, they often include it as a species of view that holds that the Platonic forms are, in fact, concrete objects. And here, abstract means something like having no causal efficacy, whereas being concrete would mean to have causal efficacy. For his part, Russell was among those who have been unwilling to doubt the existence of real universals. Now, of course, for an agnostic naturalist / atheist like Russell, if you want to believe in the Platonic forms, the only available option is to have them exist on their own. In other words, for Bertrand Russell, there's no God, so you cannot place the forms in the mind of God. You have to have them in some Platonic heaven. Now, interestingly here, the previously mentioned logician Frege, whose work influenced Russell greatly, likewise situated these abstract objects in what he called a third realm. For Frege, the first realm was the external world of concrete objects that we bump into all the time, and the second realm was the private world of our own conscious experience and thoughts. But you might be asking yourself, how can an agnostic or atheist like Russell believe in Platonic forms at all? And the answer should be understood in the context of the history of ideas. Since at least the birth of modern philosophy, with thinkers like René Descartes, there has been a drift in some influential philosophical circles. Initially, the drift was slow and it quickened much later, toward articulating a fully naturalistic account of reality. This sort of an account would be one that makes no reference to anything other than the deliverances of science. Sometimes this is what positivism is defined as. At the same time, arguably, you need certain things in order for science to even get off the ground. Now, enumerating precisely just what these prerequisites for science are is controversial, like everything else we've been talking about. However, a number of philosophers have thought that the list of prerequisites should include things like classes, numbers, properties, sets, and so forth. So, in his Problems of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell wrote, quote, "The problem with which we are now concerned is a very old one, since it was brought into philosophy by Plato. Plato's theory of ideas is an attempt to solve this very problem, and in my opinion, it is one of the most successful attempts hitherto made. The theory to be advocated in what follows is largely Plato's, with merely such modifications as time has shown to be necessary." End quote. In other words, Russell thought not only that abstract objects like numbers were necessary, he thought that Plato's attempt to explain what they were was one of the most successful that's ever been attempted. Now, in addition to this, Russell did think that the question of how to justify all these assumptions, and in fact to justify science itself, was highly problematic. And this bothered him considerably, since he was so wedded to science as the key to understanding reality. The fact was, he was never able to establish the foundation of science to his own satisfaction. In the end, he had to be content with a sort of pragmatic justification. Science seems to work. Therefore, even though we can't be certain that it's true, that is, we can't know that science is putting us into contact with bedrock reality. Nevertheless, by Russell's lights, we have more reason to put our faith into science, so to speak, than we have to put our faith into any rival system. That's Russell. Now, this state of affairs continued via Russell's intellectual heirs like Willard Van Orman Quine and Hilary Putnam. Quine and Putnam put it like this: like it or not, math is necessary for science, and numbers and other abstracta are necessary for math. This is called the indispensability argument, and it's used to support varieties of mathematical Platonism. Okay, so in conclusion, Russell does seem to have taken a dim view of the spiritual aspects of Neoplatonism, but at the same time, you should recognize that Russell was deeply influenced by Platonism, not just in a kind of a general sense in which any philosopher in the Western tradition has been influenced by Plato. That was Whitehead's point. But rather, Russell has adopted Platonism as the way to ground numbers, which he thinks are necessary, indispensable for science. So I hope that helps. If I've neglected anything, please let me know in the comments. Or if in fact you were thinking of something else when you asked the question, something that I didn't even address, feel free to re-articulate the question in a different way. But okay, that's all for now.